Well, good afternoon if you are in New York City or Chicago or Madison, Wisconsin or Buenos Aires, Argentina. Good evening if you are in London or Paris or Łódź in Poland or anywhere in Africa. Greetings to people all around the world with special love to our loved ones in Ukraine. Stay strong. We are with you. Welcome to Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. As you know, Adagio is a video and audio streaming platform. We are back. Okay, I think we are back. I said that I'm delighted to have my guest today, Jeffrey Siegel. Jeffrey Siegel is a magnificent pianist whose work I've known and admired for many years. And he's also a splendid, famous educator. And we're going to talk about both of these elements of his work today. Anyone who follows opera, classical music in the United States and the world knows the work of Jeffrey Siegel. I've never met him until very, very recently when we were both attending a play, Eisenhower, this piece of ground about the former president and military leader, Dwight David Eisenhower, in a one-man show by John Rubinstein, who I do know somewhat. John was a guest on this show about 3 years ago. He's a marvelous actor, musician, narrator, and the son of the pianist Arthur Rubinstein. And two guys were hanging around backstage to see John Rubinstein after the show. One of them was me, and the other was this man who looked kind of familiar, but I wasn't quite sure. And he said, "Hi, I'm Jeffrey." And I said, "Hi, I'm Fred." And it took a few moments to figure out which Jeffrey this was when I put together the Rubinstein connection of father and son. And that's how I met Jeffrey. And I immediately asked him to be on this program. I immediately asked him for a connection to a piano tuner. And so, Jeffrey, thank you very much for coming today and welcome.
It's a pleasure, and I thank you for the invitation.
Sure. So let's start a bit with Arthur Rubinstein, who obviously was one of the most famous, beloved pianists in history, very influential. He cut across numerous media and many time zones, from Poland to Los Angeles to Hollywood, living in Paris, living in London, cutting a huge swath musically, culturally, and you knew him.
Yes, I was privileged to play for him in 1968, and his very warm words and encouragement were tremendously important and vital to me and greatly appreciated. And from time to time, he would surprise me and show up at New York recitals of mine, one in Tully Hall and another at the Metropolitan Museum. And of course, everybody knew he was in the audience except me. And then when he would come backstage, the the people would part, and Mrs. Rubinstein would come into the artist room. And he was always very, very nice. I particularly appreciated on one particular occasion, he said, "You know, I'd like to discuss your interpretation of the Ravel valses. Call me tomorrow morning. We can discuss this over the phone." So he was very, very important and encouraging for me. I'm most grateful.
Now, one thing that I love about musical history, musical pedagogy, is that you can form a line with many people that goes, in my case, I studied with people who knew Puccini, and those people knew Verdi or knew Toscanini and so forth. I meet instrumentalists who go back to Joseph Joachim or to Brahms, pianists going way back to Liszt. There are different techniques, there are different approaches, there are almost different schools, and it's kind of like having either a pedigree or a DNA when we talk about, I studied with so-and-so who knew so-and-so who knew so-and-so. Is there something to that, or is it exaggerated?
No, I think there's something to it, and it's a very important point. Um, Two of the teachers I was privileged to study with when I was in my teens were in their 80s when I got to them. The grand old master Rudolph Gans in
Mm.
Chicago, who, of course, was a Busoni pupil, and Rosina Levine at the Juilliard School in New York, where there was this old great tradition of the Russians. So I remember being called at one point a young pianist in the old tradition. And I feel the musical values that I received from Mr. Rubinstein when I had the privilege of playing for him, but also for Rudolph Gans and for Rosina Levine. These were major influences on me from my youth to the present day.
If my memory serves, and it's pretty good, Rubinstein met Ravel in Paris in 1914 or so. And
Sounds right.
therefore,
Yeah.
there is this direct connection. What do you think that young Arthur Rubinstein learned? It's a given that he was a genius or very good at absorbing, at the very least, from the master Ravel. And what did he transmit to you?
I think he transmitted to me that the waltzes that I were playing were a little quick for the tempos that were in the day that Ravel wrote the piece. And now I find when I hear young pianists play this piece, I find I'm making the same criticism. Tempos seem to be very fast.
I yesterday spent much of the day making a recording that will come out. It's a podcast type recording. I cannot reveal the content for now because it's still being edited, but what I had to do was listen to about 20 versions of a particular very famous Italian aria for tenor. And I came to the conclusion that based on when the recordings were made, I'll start with the first one, Caruso, and the last one, which was a few months ago, that there were stylistic issues, not just related to the temperament of the singer, but to the recording technology, but primarily the expressive means that the singer started with. Caruso's recording was by far the slowest. Many of the more recent recordings were quicker. Some of them in the 1950s were very declamatory. Some of them in the 1980s were very lyrical. The more recent ones were very, I mean this in a good way, precious. And therefore, but it was the same notes, it was the same words. And nonetheless, the way these different men approached that music spoke to me not so much about them personally, but about the taste and the traditions of the times. Have things musically sped up? Can we generalize to that?
I think so. I remember playing the last movement of the first Brahms piano concerto for a piano lesson I had with Rudolph Gans. And I remembered him saying, you know, I come from the days when Brahms was still alive and the tempos weren't so fast, and he would circle the ma non troppo. And then he looked out at the insane traffic on Michigan Avenue and sadly went back and circled the allegro.
But I'm concerned about this because it's not that we have to replicate exactly what Beethoven or Brahms wanted. How could we know that? We can
Exactly.
see the markings. Then it's up to us as interpreters to interpret based on those very same notes and score markings. But I've been wondering lately about this a lot. I know concert programs sometimes are shorter. The perception is the attention span is shorter. The perception is that people have places to go and things to do. For me, when I go to a concert, and last night I went to the Met and heard Lisa Davidson, the great Norwegian soprano, in recital, it was marvelous, and she got a sensational ovation from the audience. But after the first encore, people started streaming out. And in my day, which is to say when I was a young man, we would stay and want more encores. And I'm not saying she didn't give a generous program. She would give a very generous program. But I remember that Montserrat Caballé used to do 8 or 9 or 10 encores, and nobody would leave. And I'm talking 1978. I'm not talking 1928. And So I've been wondering about, it's kind of like some people feel it's a ritual to go, to put your feet down, to hear your Beethoven or your Verdi, and then go. And I miss the days when after a performance you would hang outside or go to a nearby restaurant and talk about what you just heard and experienced.
Yeah,
Is this
that seems to
is
have
this
gone.
going?
Yes, I think it is. A lot of it is indeed the limited concentration span that you very wisely pointed out. We have a much shorter concentration span today, and as you know, in New York, it's difficult to find restaurants that are open after 10 o'clock at night,
Yeah,
which is not the way it used to be.
yeah.
And I think that's certainly a factor. Getting back to something that you very intelligently pointed out in terms of the different interpretations of the same piece, it's interesting from contemporary reports of people who heard Chopin play Chopin. The one thing they all agreed upon is he never played the same piece the same way twice. It
Mhm.
was always had an improvisational quality. And it must have been agony for him to actually write down, and it had to do it 3 times for the French edition, the English edition, and the German edition. There was no international copyright in those days. It must have been difficult for him to make what he thought were final choices. And then he'd play these pieces very freely. I think there's something to be gained from thinking about that.
Let's get into Chopin. I confess that he was not the first composer I fell in love with. It took me a lot of time. But the other composer that way was Schubert. So this is my shortcoming, not Chopin or Schubert. But I've come to love his music a lot. And also I adore Schubert's music really a lot. But do you think that Chopin's music is something that is immediately grasped, or is it something that requires either more immersion or a different kind of mood to sit and hear and experience?
I think both Chopin and Schubert were amongst the great melody writers of all time. It may be difficult for you because you're used to hearing melodies with words. And
Hmm.
here are composers, when you think of the sonatas of Schubert, for example, or the many piano pieces of Chopin, they're without words. And I think for an opera buff like yourself, that might be what might have been the immediate block for you. But I think as you've listened more to this music, of course, you've recognized the beauty of those melodies and they've engaged you as compositions. And there's certainly room for both in one's life.
Well, definitely, but I will just push back a little because we scarcely know each other. That my early foundations really were classical music rather than opera, which I came to
Uh-huh.
on my own for work. My dad was a trombonist, and I grew up very much under the guise of Leonard Bernstein because I was one of the kids, his focus group that he would
Uh-huh.
test out his ideas on before doing his young person's concert. So,
Uh-huh.
um, and he was the one who taught me Brahms and Ravel and Poulenc and people like that. When I say he and me, I was a group of 7 kids. And so therefore I really grew up with that. One of my earliest loves was Haydn, and I didn't even know that Haydn composed many operas. I loved Haydn musically, symphonically. And I think that every person, whether he or she is a professional, whether he is a strong amateur like me, whatever they are, that they have a particular feeling for the sound of certain composers. And it took me more time with Chopin. I think it was the intimacy of Chopin that required a different kind of listening. And as I heard him in smaller halls, I got to like him a lot more. As I
Mhm.
got recordings, Chopin on my CD player was always highly favored. And I could listen at home to Chopin a lot alone, but it took me a long time to get to him in the concert hall. I read about Rubinstein, who famously played Chopin. They were both Polish, that he recorded almost everything but the etudes. What is it about the etudes that he would not have recorded them, or not much?
Yeah, I think most pianists would agree with me that the etudes are the summit of what is required of a piano virtuoso. They were written more than 200 years ago, and they still to this day tax the greatest virtuosi. They're very difficult to play. And I think Mr. Rubinstein felt within himself, I think wrongly, but he felt that he could not do justice to the etudes. He played some of them, but not all. And one of the questions I think he hated to be asked is why he didn't record all the 24 or 27 etudes of Chopin. And I once in private asked him this, and he said, "Ah, they're so difficult. I play some of them, but some of them," and he just threw his hands up in the air. So there was a certain humility there. And today, kids come into Juilliard Conservatory and they sit down and play them without knowing how difficult they are. So there we
are. I think my breakthrough with Chopin, I can tell you when it came. It was 1999. And everyone's relationship to music is often about personal experience. We get that in Rubinstein's two memoirs, certainly. And it was because I was in Paris, I was working in Paris, but I also knew that a very beautiful and dear friend of mine from Northern Italy was going to be in Paris studying at cooking school. So I planned my work to be in Paris when she was in Paris. And we went out for a walk one day. We went to Ediard, which was a wonderful food shop on the Place de la Madeleine. And then we turned the corner and I saw a sign in French in front of the Church of Madeleine, Chopin's funeral. And it seems that Chopin had died 150 years before, and they were recreating his funeral in 1999 with the same music that was played at his funeral in 1849. Patrizio was my friend, is my friend. And so I said, we're going to a funeral. We carried our little food packages in and we sat down and we attended a recreation of Chopin's funeral. And we heard how his body was buried in France, his heart was buried in Poland. And I then did a lot of research about Chopin's heart, which I invite people to do, and how during World War II, both the Nazis and the Russians, everybody wanted it, but how the heart was saved and protected in a secret spot and then restored after to public worship, let's call it. And I mean, how romantic is that his heart would be taken to Poland while his body remained in Paris? It was absolutely fascinating. It's the kind of thing the French do incredibly well. And after that, I just felt I had to know everything about him. So I traveled to the Balearic Islands. Was it Mallorca or Menorca? Mallorca. And visited the place where he went with George Sand and where he studied. And I think you can see where I'm going. The more we know about the life of a composer, somehow we deepen our relationship with his or her work. I don't know if that's always a good thing, and I will explore that with you in a few minutes. But this is where I began to listen to Chopin differently, when I began to see the places where he wrote different music and read the letters and read notes and read commentary of people about him, read about his illnesses and so on. And so these people, even through memoir, become people. Now, yes, there are fantastical, inaccurate memoirs such as those of Rossini and Berlioz, but that doesn't make them any less interesting to me. Mm. And so my question to you first, as a young pianist, piano student, and later as an educator, but I really want to stick now to the performer, to what degree for you was it the notes and the markings, and to what degree was it learning about the composer?
It's both. I think my friend Alan Walker, who wrote a fantastic biography of Chopin a couple of years ago, it came out. He said it very well. He can't imagine a day anywhere in the civilized world where the music of Chopin is not being played. And perhaps no composer of instrumental music wrote music that is more immediately accessible to a greater number of people than the music of Chopin. It's an interesting combination of qualities with Chopin. His father was French, the name, of course, and his mother was Polish. And interestingly enough, half his life was spent in Poland, the first 20 years of his life, and the remaining years were spent in France. So the French have a good claim to half of Chopin. And there is the French element in his music of elegance and polish, but there's certainly great nationalistic Polish fervor, particularly to be found in the mazurkas and in the polonaises. Yeah. And I think Dr. Walker is absolutely right. I can't imagine a composer of certainly piano music whose music is so immediately appealing and accessible as is the case with Chopin.
And yet, at least in my case, it was not immediately accessible. It was accessible in that I could hear it anytime I wanted, but something within me was not fully embracing it. I didn't ever dislike it, but I'm just saying that there's certain music, such as Haydn, for example, that I immediately took to and loved, and other composers required a lot more work on my part, because this stuff is also work, even if it's not your profession. It's not bad work, it's thrilling, exciting work, but it is work nonetheless to really not have it be background music at brunch.
Yeah.
Or and not have it be the music to go to sleep to.
It has to be said also that hearing Chopin in a large concert hall like Carnegie Hall is not the setting that he wanted. He hated that, unlike Liszt, who loved the big concert halls to play and wow many people. Chopin was happiest in an intimate salon. And there's a certain private intimacy, even in his big pieces, which are more suitable for an intimate space. And so if you're used to hearing an orchestra, and the orchestra medium or the opera house is your normal space, Chopin would take some doing to get used to. Yes.
Now, I want to get to a technical detail of you and all pianists that I just thought of. I mean, I've thought of it in the past, but you brought it back now. If you're playing a big piano, a Steinway, whichever your brand is, in a large hall, or you're playing the same music in a salon that may hold 60 seats, or in a classroom that may hold 20 seats, what's different in playing that same music, and to what degree do you as the performer have to adjust or accommodate to the space so that it won't sound like you're in Carnegie Hall when you're in a room of 60 people?
Yeah, it's a very good point, Fred. And an experienced colleague almost senses this as soon as he walks into the space. And you probably will play less strongly in a smaller place and use less pedal, meaning you don't want to blur the sonorities. And this is particularly true if you're playing in a large church where there's a lot of echo and overhang. You have to be very sparse with blending the sonorities, because that's going to happen in the church all by itself. An experienced performer almost always by experience begins to make this adjustment, and I think most of my colleagues would give you the same answer.
I had on several occasions in my job at the Metropolitan Opera the privilege, the opportunity, the frightening reality of being the person who had to assist Vladimir Horowitz as he would come and rehearse and adjust his piano playing to the sound of the hall empty, and then during a performance come off the stage when the theater was full, and have him lament that he doesn't like how he sounds because it's different with all those people there. And he would have his wife, Wanda, and other people sit at different places in the hall during the empty rehearsal, and then again during the performance, and report back to him about how it sounded and what he should be doing, which to me in real time sounds horrifying, that you're getting messages from Wanda Toscanini about how you sound. But there must, I mean, I've only spoken and occasionally sung in public, so I don't know what it's like to play an instrument in public, but there must be, how do you know? I mean, if you're on the stage in an empty hall and then in a theater. And after that, I'll preface it with an experience I had with a conductor. But you tell me first.
Yeah. In a way, you're playing, of course, for the audience, but the audience is many different people in many different acoustical places in the hall. And in an essence, you can take that just so far. It's really what you are hearing on stage. If you know you're playing in a loud, reverberant hall, you may play one way. And if you know that you're playing in a hall where the acoustics needs greater projection, you sense this as you're playing if you're a performer. Yeah.
I had an experience 20 years ago that I feel so fortunate because this is how I learn and then I can teach. I asked Valery Gergiev, who was then bringing his Mariinsky Orchestra on a short tour of North America for an old Stravinsky program, how he would adjust given that he was playing in Orchestra Hall in Chicago, the theater in Ann Arbor, Michigan, the then acoustically unfriendly theater in Toronto, not the current one, and then what was called Avery Fisher Hall in Lincoln Center, which had mixed values as an acoustical space. And he invited me to come on the tour and to listen in all four theaters and to sit with him in rehearsal before, sit on the stage and watch him work and listen to the hall. And what he did, which you can't quite do with a piano, or maybe you can in different ways, is he would reseat the musicians to get the sound that he wanted. So that if the hall in Toronto, whose name I'm forgetting, was drier, he would bring certain instruments forward. Orchestra Hall in Chicago was a little more generous, so he would reseat them in a different way. And I will say that the music sounded the same in each of the four performances I heard, even though the musicians were seated differently. Obviously, a solo instrumentalist on a stage with a piano cannot reseat his piano. I remember that Horvitz used to move his piano around the stage during rehearsal, inches here and there, but for the most part, the accommodation has to be made by the performer in performance. Is there any equivalency to what I was talking about with Gergiev and the Mariinsky for a pianist?
No, but I don't think so. One can be fussy about it to a certain extent, but certainly in some halls, the brass can project greatly in one particular hall, and it can be muffled in another. But the conductor, it seems to me, and I've worked with some really remarkable conductors in my time, they are balancing as they go along from the podium during the concert. And if the orchestra is watching carefully, the balancing is going on as we hear the performance.
And here's the question I, believe it or not, have never asked a pianist, although I should have maybe 50 years ago. I've been to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of concerts with orchestra and piano concerto. And typically, in most cases, the conductor is behind the piano, let's say, a little northeast of the piano. The pianist is seated a little more downstage near typically the string section, the violins. And I'm going to use the pronoun he because it's you. What do you see of the conductor? And what don't you see? Is the lid, does it obstruct? What is the unspoken communication between pianist and conductor when you're playing a piano concerto?
Yeah, the lid does not get in the way, and the conductor and the soloist really do need to see one another. Although I've worked with some fabulous conductors who listen so carefully that they really don't need to look at you for cues or look at the keyboard as when you're going to get to the top note of that scale and so on. They just listen very, very intently. And you know within a few minutes of the first rehearsal the conductor is going to be there. No, we see one another enough, but it's really a question of how carefully one listens.
Have you ever played with a conductor who also happened to be the composer of the music you're playing? Pierre Boulez, perhaps?
I did work with Pierre Boulez. I was his soloist with the New York Philharmonic, but it was in a
Mhm.
Prokofiev concerto.
Okay.
And no, I've had the experience of playing the Samuel Barber concerto with Mr. Barber in the audience, but that's
Okay.
not the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, would you care to name a conductor or two who proved very meaningful or very instructive for you in terms of ways of seeing performing and the music that might have been different from 2 weeks before you met the conductor?
I had the great privilege of playing the Mozart K467 with Sir George Schulte in Chicago. And he had Mahler 1 on the same program and the Ives Unanswered Question. And I thought I'd get the last 15 minutes of the rehearsal. Not only did he want 2 rehearsals for the concerto, but he wanted to meet with me in his studio for an hour before the first rehearsal. And I thanked him for the time that he was giving to the concerto. And he stopped me. He says, "It's a Mozart concerto, isn't it?" And I learned so much from him. He took a lot of time with me. I was quite young at the time. He took a lot of time with me to go through the piece and even made certain suggestions, particularly about rhythmic exactness. Um, I learned so much. Also, I did the Emperor at one point with Klaus Tenstedt. He too spent a lot of time with me. Um, in convincing me that the pianist can really accompany the orchestra very carefully at certain
Yeah.
points. Zubin also was very inspiring to work with. But I suppose as a continuous collaboration, my friend Leonard Slatkin and I, we think of the music so similarly that sometimes we just listen at the first rehearsal to one another, and we're usually on the same track. Yeah. No,
Hmm.
but the older conductors I've spoken of, Schulte certainly, and Klaus Tenstedt, Lauren Mazel also, it would take time to work with a young soloist, and we would talk about music in general. And these were lifelong lessons for me.
Yeah. Um, Schulte, I knew ever so slightly. I cannot claim to have worked with him much at all. I was present backstage, but I didn't work with him directly. But I was crazy about him.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I particularly loved about him that I think only Gergiev in some way emulates, but not to the same degree, George Schulte had the most expressive left hand of any conductor I'd ever seen, and got more out of the Chicago Symphony, out of wherever he was playing. I heard him in Vienna a fair amount. Um, and I always marveled at the hand because he was not gesturing what the music felt, but somehow he got something more out of the musicians with the left hand than most others did. And I even wrote an article once called The Left Hand of God. And it was about George Schulte's left hand because I when I went to Schulte performances, I would try to get a seat on the side rather than the front or back, in other words, his back, so that I could watch his left hand and listen to the music and what it drew out. And it was really quite something. And Klaus Tenstedt as well, I greatly admired. I did work with him on a production of Elektra, and
Ah,
he was fascinating. He was so bright, also on Fidelio. And I heard Bernstein, heard them all. I think the best Fidelio conducting I ever heard was actually Klaus Tenstedt, who just really connected to it. And he's much missed. I think he's a little bit forgotten, and I'm glad you brought him up because he was extraordinary.
it's very interesting. Your father was a trombonist in the
Yes.
orchestra. My father was a string bass player in the Chicago Symphony Orchestra.
Okay.
And Tenstedt, as you know, used to be a violinist in the orchestra and then conducted. I think there's a certain kinship amongst us for this particular
Hmm.
reason. Schulte, of course, was at first a pianist, and
Yeah,
I think the expressive left hand for him came from, if you will, being a pianist and shaping phrases as much with the accompaniment when you're playing the piano as you do with the orchestra.
that
And
makes sense.
the days of Schulte and Giulini in Chicago were extraordinary. The same orchestra could sound completely different with both of these conductors, and I sometimes heard them do similar repertoire, and I'd be hard pressed to say which I liked better because both were magnificent.
So I did get to work with Giulini in Los Angeles, but I want to ask you not about his opera work, but about his orchestral work. Wise graybeards used to say to me that the best Brahms symphonies were those conducted by Giulini. And I don't subscribe to best.
Yeah.
I will subscribe to compelling, interesting, fascinating, moving, whatever. But why would a man from Puglia in southern Italy have such a particular kinship or recognition with the music, the very central European music of Brahms, and be able to make something of it that was very special?
I agree with you about Giulini's Brahms. And interestingly enough, in one season, I heard both Scholti and Giulini conduct a Brahms symphony. Same orchestra, completely different. And I would not want to have to say which I liked better. Both of them transported me when I heard them. And Giulini simply was one of those conductors you were privileged to hear. He brought up the great lyricism, of course, in the music that he.
So I decided for you not to do too much research because I wanted just to have a very free-flowing conversation as we are. But I discovered that you and I actually have a couple of things in common that you probably wouldn't know. They're not that remarkable, but they are commonalities. You're from Chicago. I studied at Northwestern University, and then I studied at the University of Wisconsin, where you, I believe, were very active. Were you a teacher? Did you do your keyboard conversations there? What was the, and we will get into the keyboard conversations, but
Yeah.
You were in Madison, Wisconsin a fair amount as well.
For 25 years, I did the
25 years. Okay.
conversations in Madison, and the attendance was very touching. I had university professors, and I had young students who had never been to a concert before, which is in many ways my typical audience for keyboard conversations.
Mhm.
But it was a great joy. We did 4 concerts a year for 25 years. And interesting enough, you mentioned Chicago. The longest running series of the keyboard conversations is at Northwestern University
Mhm.
in suburban Evanston. We are this season beginning season 55.
Fantastic.
So
I'll get into that in a minute. I just want to mention Madison, Wisconsin for a particular reason. Were these keyboard conversations done in the Wisconsin Union Theater?
they were done in the Union Theater, but they were done before at a smaller hall. I can't remember the name of it, a theater hall. But we moved eventually to the Union Theater.
Was the theater hall in the music department, which was just near University Avenue, and it was an old building surrounded by new buildings. But I asked because the Wisconsin Union Theater was and is part of the phenomenon that people from elsewhere don't know about, that many American universities, but especially what used to be called the Big Ten of the Midwest, so Ohio State, Wisconsin, Northwestern, Illinois, Michigan, especially Indiana, had and have very famous music departments with very important theaters. And it was typical in the mid to late 20th century for artists of your stature to tour and not just play New York and Chicago and Los Angeles and Washington, perhaps, but this circuit. So that when I was a student at the University of Wisconsin, all the greats were coming through. Sturkin, the first time I heard Shirley Verrett was not in New York, but in Madison. And I got a job as an usher, and then I learned backstage life at the Wisconsin Union Theater. And it happened to be in what was called the Wisconsin Union, which was basically a big recreational center with a huge Rathskeller that was something right out of Heidelberg, where you could go have beers and bratwurst and so on, and then hear a concert. And I felt like the student prince in a way, because it was that level of professionalism and that dedication to the arts that was very, very impressive to me. And to some degree, it's changed. Certain schools, especially Indiana and Michigan, have maintained these traditions. others less so. But I point this out because I want people to understand that people of my age and a bit younger got our formations not through some fancy education, but through access to buildings like this, to places like this, to artists such as yourself, who always came and always taught and always drew audiences because we were drawn to learning. And we were students in that case, and part of our education was hearing great performers at our university.
I remember when Emil Gilels made his first couple of US tours, one of the places, he didn't just play the big cities. I remember him going to Madison, Wisconsin to play, I think it was at the Union. I was very impressed by this. I think it has to be said, however, Fred, that there has been a diminuendo, I would say even a molto diminuendo of this kind of concert scheduling in the country in general, but certainly in the universities and in the smaller towns. I think this is simply a fact, and we can talk perhaps in another interview about the causes for this and the whys and the wherefores. But what you and I remember from the college concert series of younger days, it's a molto diminuendo from that now.
I agree with you, and we can talk about it a bit now. I wonder why. In your opinion, why do you think that there has been a diminution of the attendance, but also not so much attendance, the programming? Because if you don't program it, people don't attend.
Yeah. This is a long and difficult subject, but whether we're talking about the Philadelphia Orchestra or we're talking about a college series, whether we're talking about the effects of COVID or what was going on even before COVID that COVID accelerated, in essence, there's no denying the facts that concert attendance is not what it was. Subscriptions has become a passé idea because people know they can go at the last minute and get the seats that they want. This is a huge subject, and people who have been in the profession for a number of years recognize that this is so. The question of what to do about it is something that I think is perplexing people who are running symphony orchestras and concert series. What do you do to try to bring the live music to your public, live classical music to your public?
Yeah. When I was a kid studying at Northwestern and working at Lyric Opera Chicago, the Lyric had the foremost proponent of subscription concerts and performances. His name was Danny Newman. I don't know if you ever met him.
Of course.
And Danny was a very enthusiastic individual. I liked him very much. And he wrote a book called Subscribe, ! And he believed that theaters or opera companies or symphony orchestras needed to build an emotional relationship with the audiences, that it was not simply something you do as a distraction, but something that you feel and that you care about. And then the programming should be, the Lyric did, what they called 75-25. In other words, of the 8 operas, 75% or 6 of them would be the Aidas, the Marriage of Figaro, Barbara of Seville, things like that. One opera would be more of a rarity that you don't see very often, Mignon, let's say. And then the last opera would be something very new and challenging and different. And you can sell out that last opera because you will have sold the Aidas and Traviatas and Butterflies that brings people in. And the Lyric at that time was fully subscribed. But it related to the public image of the head of the company, who in my era was Hardis Kranick. But it related to the fact that Chicagoans became very proud of having this company. I think Chicago, which at that time was known as the second city in size, it's now third, rivaled New York and had a fabulous orchestra. Many people said better than New York, had the wonderful Art Institute. The sense of competition with New York and civic pride in Chicago made Chicagoans want to support and participate not just in the football Bears and the basketball Bulls and the lovable but terrible Chicago Cub baseball team, but also their arts institutions, their museums. And yes, it's kind of changed in Chicago as well. And I wonder always, is it the distraction of the screens that we have, whether it's, computers, phones, whatever, whether we don't know how to listen in the same way? I teach a class occasionally called The Art of Listening, and about the difference between hearing and listening. You and I are listening to each other very carefully now and are responding not just to what we intended to say, but what the other guy said. And that's conversation. That is interaction, and that is from a stage with a performer communication that an audience is ready to receive. I think that many arts institutions have conflated marketing with education, and that doesn't work well at all. You can make someone seem like he or she is the next big star, and therefore you want a ticket because that person's a star, or pretty, or whatever, or you want to hear that person because they're a great artist. And then you have to educate about what great artistry is without saying singer A, pianist A is better than singer A, pianist, or pianist B. And I think we've lost that. I think that marketing has become so overwhelming, and the sense of presence on social media, that we no longer try to understand quality, try to understand what makes it good, which leads me to the fact that your career has been not only as a splendid pianist, but as a superb educator. And I believe since 1968, you've done what are called keyboard conversations. Is that true?
Yeah, keyboard conversations, I should stress, are concerts, but they're concerts with commentary. Every work on a keyboard conversation program is performed in its entirety, so it's like a recital program. But rather than written program notes, I speak to the audience before playing each piece in non-technical language and very briefly about the piece of music that they are going to hear. If there's something going on in the composer's life when he writes the piece that's of significance, I share that. Sometimes just the miraculous way in which the composer cooks up the piece of music with these particular pieces of musical material. And I do feel, and I'm told by the members of the audience afterward, that this helps to make the listening experience more than just a pleasant ear wash of sound. And it's been so gratifying, Fred. I get people who have heard the Moonlight Sonata all their life and are shocked to find out what a revolutionary piece of music this really is, and how shocking it was for Beethoven to write something like this at the time that he did. And thankfully, I'm getting people who've never been to a concert before, senior citizens as well as young people, who know they're missing something, not to have Beethoven in their life, but they're looking for what a friend of mine called a gentle inoculation into the joys of listening to classical music. Just as you were inspired by Leonard Bernstein in your youth, so was for me. He wanted to infect the world, so to speak, with his love of music. And that got through to me. And after more than 50 years experience trying to do this, it's been very, very gratifying to be doing these programs. And I think, if I may say so, I think the need for these programs is greater now than when I started doing them 55 years ago.
I agree. But what prompted you to do that? You were a young man. Did you feel that it was something you needed to add? Did you have a natural inclination as an educator that prompted you to do that? Why did you start?
Interesting. I was soloist with the Philadelphia Orchestra, and there was a party on the main line after the concert. And a lovely woman came up to me and said, I'm a subscriber to the orchestra. I hear the orchestra every week. I listen to WRTI all the time. But I wish my listening experience could be more than just sitting there and absorbing the pretty sounds. Can't a musician like you say something about the music to me, which will make that listening experience richer and more focused? And Fred, at the same party, a young man came up to me, rather shy, admitted it was his first concert. he said, I sort of liked it. I read the program notes, but I felt totally confused. I don't know what a major or a minor key is or a tonic dominant relationship. Can't a musician like you say something for somebody like me in the audience, which will make the listening experience more accessible and inviting? I went back to the hotel that night and I thought of both these listeners, the concert goer who's looking for a more enriched and focused listening experience, and the novice who's looking for something introductory that's welcoming, where you don't mention major and minor keys and
Mhm.
tonic and dominant relationship. And I thought, how can we get through to these people? And of course, Bernstein was already doing this and most successfully. And so that was the moment when the light went off. And I was very happy being soloist with orchestras. That was what I was doing at the time. But this really got through to me.
Where did you do your first one?
My first one was given in a public school in New York.
Mhm.
And a friend of mine who was a board member at Northwestern happened to hear this little concert. He was visiting New York and he came back, his eyes aglow. He says, "This is not just for kids. I'm a Chicago Symphony subscriber and I learned a lot. Let's underwrite a series of these in Chicago." And that's how it got started in 1968, 69.
And you just gave a perfect example of what I was saying about Chicago, that it was very can-do. It
Yes.
was, we want this for Chicago, which it's a wonderful thing among many wonderful things about Chicago, is that someone will always find a way to make something happen.
Yes, and it's interesting. Our mutual friend Harvey Sachs, as you know, he's a good friend of Muti's. One
Hmm.
of the reasons Muti loves Chicago and loves the orchestra is exactly what you were saying.
Yeah, yeah. It's a very particular thing about that city, and I've not been there for a few years. I used to go constantly, but I miss it very much because there's a wonderful spirit about the city, even with all the urban problems that it faces, as many do. And Chicago often really has extreme urban problems, but nonetheless, it's very refreshing and it's very affirming when you go there, and they find ways to make things happen and make things work. And people will underwrite, or people will see a civic good in doing that in Chicago. So what I did the other day, and it looks like Jeffrey may have frozen with the Zoom. We'll see what happens. I don't know if you hear
Yeah.
me, but all right. So there he is. Okay. What I was saying, Jeffrey, is the other day I printed out, I had to get different paper, your current offerings on your keyboard conversations. And this is basically your current season. You're very soon going to Chicago for a Mozart and Friends keyboard conversation, Beethoven, Haydn, and Mozart. Talk about how you would do that particular program, because I can't go through every single thing you're doing, but it's
Oh,
remarkable. Chicago, Cleveland, Fairfax, Virginia, Manassas, Virginia, New York City, Palm Desert, Philadelphia, Richardson, Texas, Scottsdale, Arizona, St. Paul, Minnesota, Utica, New York. This is just in the coming months. So you are, as George Burns used to say, I'm booked.
yeah. The Mozart and Friends program, by the way, will be done in New York on the 3rd of October, and I'm extending an invitation to you. I do them at the Victor Borge Hall of the Scandinavia House.
Which I love.
Mozart and
I have to decline now because I'm teaching my opera class at NYU that night, but otherwise I'd be there.
you have a very good excuse.
Okay.
Uh, Mozart's friends were Haydn and Beethoven and Hummel, Johann Nepomuk Hummel. And we're going to hear on that particular program a set of variations Mozart wrote on what we know as Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and a set of variations that Beethoven wrote on God Save the King. We're
Mhm.
going to hear some works of Haydn that certainly inspired Mozart and Beethoven. And Hummel, I always like to have something on the program that's off the beaten track. Hummel was Mozart's favorite student, and he even lived in Mozart's house for nearly 2 years when he was a very young man. Um, in some ways, Hummel had a more successful career than Mozart did. He succeeded Haydn as the Kapellmeister at the Esterhazy Palace. And he was a very notable, famous musician. And he was one of the honorary pallbearers at Beethoven's funeral. And he wrote a great deal of music. Why don't we hear more of it? So I've got a rondo of Hummels that is absolutely delightful on the program, and it intrigues the audience. What is there about this music that keeps us from listening to it? It's so attractive. One of my favorite pieces of Mozart is one that's probably not for public consumption. It's the Adagio in B minor that he writes towards the end of his life when he knows his best years are behind him. It's a piece of sorrowful resignation. It's certainly not meant to wow a large public, but it's as if Mozart is saying with this composition, you want to know what I'm really thinking and feeling at this time in my life? Listen to this piece of music. It's one of the most deeply moving compositions for me of this composer. It's not something one plays necessarily to wow the public, but if you tell them what's going on in Mozart's life when he writes this piece, and you show a couple of musical examples of what's there, how he takes one somber harmony and moves to another, the audience is absolutely brought into it.
Would that have been one of the 1791 pieces that he wrote in the very last year of his life?
It's earlier than that. It's 1787, I believe, or 88, yeah.
So in 1787 or 88, he would have written Don Giovanni. He still had Così fan tutte di Zauberflöte and La Clemenza di Tito in front of him. And yet his best years were behind him?
Yes,
and the last three symphonies, the last four symphonies.
We're not talking about Mozart, the composer. We're talking about the reaction of the public to his music. The series of subscription concerts that he was putting on in Vienna himself in the early 1780s. By 1785, the Viennese public had tired of him, and there were very few subscribers to this. It's hard for us to believe. So we're not talking about Mozart, the genius, the composer. No, we're talking about the audience reaction to him. And it's at about this time in his life that we find him writing these begging letters to Puchberg. Please, can you help me financially? It's this kind of insight that I feel is what inspired, if you will, this rather solemn piece of music.
We know that Haydn was a great proponent, supporter, and shoulder to lean on for Mozart. What about Beethoven and his relationship to Haydn?
Yeah, the story is told that in 1787, when Beethoven is 17 years old, money is raised in his native city, Bonn, for Beethoven to go to Vienna to study with Mozart. Otto Jahn writes about this in his biography of Mozart, which is 50 years after the time. We don't know if it actually happened, but it's believed that it did. And the story goes that Mozart at first was not all that impressed with what Beethoven had prepared to play for him, some early piano pieces. But he sensed something about Beethoven, so he gave him a theme and said, improvise on this, let's see what you can do. And that's what attracted Mozart. And according to the legend, Mozart said, pay attention to this young man. He's going to cause a big noise in the world one day. Unfortunately, Beethoven was not able to stay. He received a letter that his mother was ailing, and he went back to Vienna, only to return to Vienna years later to study with Haydn. Whether this story with Mozart is any truth or not, we'll never really know, but that's the legendary story.
But I know that, at least from what I've read, that Beethoven felt that Haydn didn't have much to offer him.
Yeah, Beethoven said this, but then when you look at the early piano sonatas and the early piano trios, where he seems to take a short motive and go to town with it, as Haydn was able to do, and the sense of humor in mixing phrases that don't seem to go with one another in such a way, I think the influence on Haydn from Haydn is there. I think Beethoven just chose not to want to acknowledge it.
So I'm going to use a term that I think you'll know what I mean, big biography. That certainly Mozart, but especially Beethoven, has big biography attached to him about the hearing, about his frustrations, about his unknown beloved. I forget what they called her in German, but the woman that supposedly he loved and was inspired by. But I think my problem with big biography is that poor Beethoven had to carry the burden of being upset and cranky and misunderstood all the time. I, in late Beethoven, apart from the famous quartets that are, so mysterious, I hear a lot of humor. The Diabelli variations, for example, there's humor there.
There certainly is, and it's interesting you mentioned this. I am doing a program this season that I call The Power and Passion of Beethoven, and on this program is the sonata that Beethoven has special affection for, the Opus 78 sonata dedicated to Teresa von Brunswick, who was thought for a long time to be the immortal beloved.
Yeah.
And there's a tenderness in this piece of music and a sense of fun and a delight of living that is absolutely coming out of every pore of the piece for the two movements. And yes, it's completely different from the Eroica or the Fifth Symphony, but it shows exactly that side of Beethoven that you're talking about.
And I think that Beethoven, who I adore, it sounds silly to have to say that, but I do, is burdened by the fact that he wrote something, I think it's 1802, but I'd have to check, called the Heiligenstadt Testament, in which he basically, around the time of his Fourth Symphony, understood that his health was declining. And it's sort of a mission statement about what he would do for the rest of his life, given his declining health, his failed hearing, all that was going on in his life. And when you read something like that, it's very moving. But then you think, oh, that's the reason that he wrote the Ninth, or that's the reason that he would write whatever he wrote. And I say this because I love, as I said to you about Chopin, studying the lives of composers and what they did and what they wrote in terms of letters and memoirs. But sometimes I just want to hear the music as it was.
Yeah. I think most musicians would be the first ones to agree with you that music speaks for itself. Yes, the listening experience can be enhanced, I think, when you know what's going on and how the composer put the piece together, et cetera, et cetera. Is it necessary? No. What was it, Stravinsky who said music speaks for itself?
Mm-hmm.
And was it Bernstein who said music can express the inexpressible? You don't need the words. You don't need it. Music speaks infinitely well for itself. Yes, it can, I think, enrich the listening experience to know something, but it's not necessary. The music speaks for itself.
I know that some of my greatest musical experiences as an audience member have come when it was completely unexpected. So you were talking, if I remember, about Kirchhoff 467 from Mozart. Is that the 22nd, the 21st?
The 21st, yes.
21st, okay. I had no expectations about Kirchhoff 488, which is the 23rd. And I was attending, Jeffrey, because you live in New York, we used to have something called the Lincoln Plaza Cinemas, where we had 6 fantastic screens across from Lincoln Center presenting all the cinema of the world, and it was a real treasure. And I would drop in of an afternoon, especially when I worked at the Met and I had time off after the rehearsal and before the evening show, and just go across the street to whatever movie was there. And I went to a French film, and I no longer remember the title. And the reason I don't remember the title was this music came on during the film that was so overwhelmingly gorgeous. And I knew it was Mozart, and not only gorgeous, but emotional, that I was in tears, not from the movie, which I forgot, but the music. And I sat through all the credits to discover what that piece was. It was played by Murray Pariah in that case. And now I'm at the point with that piece, I've studied it a lot, that I have to unlearn what I've learned about it, because I want to go back to that experience of having heard it for the first time without my having heard many pianists doing it, and the knowledge of everything that I've acquired in doing more than I think any work of piano music, such a deep immersion into that score that I need to pull back. Because now when I hear it, even in great performances, I know too much, if you know what I mean. And that's not bragging, but it's too much intimacy.
Yeah, you want to capture the overwhelming first impression with such a masterpiece.
Yeah.
I understand that very, very well. There are pieces of music that are the same for me. My study of these pieces after the initial impression gives me a different insight into the piece, but it never can take the place of hearing the first Brahms piano concerto for the first time. That overwhelming orchestral tutti that introduces the piece, unlike anything that Brahms wrote before or since.
Yeah. I do want to ask you about more of the programs that you're doing, because if I could, I would join you in Palm Desert in the winter and Virginia in the fall. It sounds like you've programmed it in such a way that you're in great parts of this country at great times of the year. A French musical feast, Debussy, Ravel, Saint-Saëns, Poulenc, Satie. That must be a very different program than the Viennese program that we were just talking about.
Yeah, it's I could have really said there's more to French music than Clair de Lune. It's interesting that Clair de Lune is a composition that the whole world knows and loves, and yet the composer didn't think very much of it, was extremely reluctant to publish it. And when you hear the other work of Debussy, which is on the program, the Prelude of the Pour le Piano Suite, you understand why he felt that Clair de Lune was old hat and he didn't want to represent him. We have the elegant sonatine of Ravel, the fantastic arrangement for the piano that Liszt made of Saint-Saëns' Danse Macabre, and Francis Poulenc is a composer for whom I have a great deal of affection. He could write great melodies. He was a very serious composer, but every once in a while, he's the naughty boy at the piano, writing real spoofs. And this novelette number 2 of Poulenc, which he wrote almost 100 years ago, is one of those. He's sticking out his tongue when thumbing his nose at all convention. It's a wonderful piece to listen to. I had, again, the influence of someone like Rudolph Ganz, my teacher in Chicago, who was 80 years old when I got to him as a teenager. He had letters in his office under glass from Debussy and Ravel thanking him for playing their compositions, when in the first decade of the 20th century, very few people were doing so. And as you know, Ravel dedicated Scarbo from the Gaspard de la Nuit to Rudolph Ganz. So he wanted to pass this on to the young student. That he used to say something very interesting, Fred, that there are 3 basic elements: music, melody, rhythm, and harmony. But with the French composers, the sound itself is an important, equally important 4th element, the sonority itself. Yeah.
Regular listeners to this program know that I revered my father. I loved him very much. He was a marvelous musician. He was a marvelous enthusiast about music, and that's a big part of why I am who I am. One of the many things that was interesting about him, he was born in 1923, is that unlike anyone else I knew who had a relationship with, let's call it classical music, my relationship to classical music and opera tended to be works written well before I was born in 1956. My father's favorites were Debussy, Prokofiev, Shostakovich, Ravel, Gershwin, Poulenc. In other words, Puccini, the music of his youth, the music that was being newly premiered when he was 5 and 6 and 7 years old, when radio had just come to New York City, and he grew up with that. He was a professional by the age of 13. But my formation was largely those composers from the first years of the 20th century, because that's what my father loved. My father obviously loved all the, quote, masters. There were only 2 composers that he didn't like at all. Giuseppe Verdi. I love my father, but wow. And Franz Liszt. And I can tell you why he didn't like Giuseppe Verdi. He played the trombone. And the only operas by Verdi he liked were Otello and Falstaff, which are great operas. But it took me years to figure out he liked those operas because they had trombone parts. Whereas Traviata and Rigoletto and all those others, not really. Aida a little bit. And Liszt, I never got a straight answer out of him about Liszt. And that's the one that I think about, because he was profoundly influential. He was a very complicated figure with his, let's call it, womanizing and religiosity, his relationships with the church, his relationships with his son-in-law Wagner. To me, he's a fascinating figure. We hear all the mythology about as being the rock star of 19th century piano, but you didn't know my dad, but you know stuff, as my father used to say. What about Liszt would my father not have embraced if he loved the composers that I explained that he did?
First of all, your father is not alone, and I'm a great believer that Liszt is the most misunderstood and underestimated of all the great composers. We know actually only a few of his works. He was as prolific as Bach in terms of the sheer number of pieces, and we don't necessarily hear his best music all the time. And I feel that he is the most misunderstood of all the great composers. We need to, I think, have the opportunity to hear more of his music, and it has to be played with a certain respect and dignity, which is not always the case, particularly, I'm sorry to say, with the piano music. But your father is not alone in having this point of view, and it's still prevalent today, very, very much so. Yeah.
I don't have that feeling. He's not my favorite, but I very happily hear Liszt because to me, apart from anything else, he connects to all these other composers and history and culture that I'm so fascinated with, and he was a central figure.
Right.
I've traveled much of Germany, but I've never been to Weimar, and I intend to go there because Liszt was fundamental in making that a very important musical destination, and the one who presented Wagner's Lohengrin when Wagner was in exile. The premiere of Lohengrin was in Weimar without Wagner being present.
Yeah,
And
Wagner probably would not have been the success that he was without the support that Liszt gave financially as well as
true.
musically in the times of Wagner's life when he was in bad need.
Do you know the wonderful detail about Liszt's final will and testament about where he would be buried?
Remind me.
Liszt said that he wants to be buried in the town where he dies. And which is very risky because if you're playing, let's say, in Saarbrücken or Bergamo, I love Bergamo, let me pick a different town, Rovigo, or who knows where, Nantes, then you're in Nantes for all eternity. As it happened, Liszt died in Bayreuth. And Wagner and his wife, who was Liszt's daughter, Cosima, are buried where they would be buried, right next to their home and theater and so on. Liszt is in a graveyard off somewhere else. And that's sort of a sad end for Franz Liszt, because most other great conductor, composer graves, we go to visit them, but nobody goes to Liszt's grave in Bayreuth.
Yes, it's most unfortunate. And it's a subject that my friend Alan Walker in his Liszt biography takes quite a bit of space and time to talk about. Yes.
So I actually just noticed that in St. Paul, Minnesota, you're doing Chopin and Liszt, sumptuous melodies and exhilarating virtuosities. You're doing that in other places as well, but my eye landed on St. Paul, Minnesota. Chopin and Liszt, I didn't plan this, that we're talking substantially about Chopin and now about Liszt. How are they paired as your presentation in Keyboard Conversations?
It's extraordinary. They were exact contemporaries. They were born a year apart from one another. Liszt was to live many years more than Chopin. And I think Chopin, for all his great accomplishment as a pianist, envied Liszt's extraordinary virtuosity. There's a letter of Chopin's where he's listening to Liszt play his etudes in the next room and saying, how I wish I could steal from Liszt the virtuosity that he brings to my etudes. And Liszt was always very supportive of Chopin. Liszt was perhaps the most generous of all the great composers of the 19th century, helping so many other composers.
Along with Rossini. I would add
yes,
Rossini.
Yes. Liszt was one of the great helpers of other people's music. He would take Schubert songs and transcribe them for the piano so that people could know what they are. And of course, as you know, excerpts from Verdi and Wagner operas, which was a way that this music got known. And the Beethoven symphonies he transcribed for
Yep.
solo piano, so that this great music could be known to more and more people. Chopin was not an arranger of other people's music, with very few exceptions. His total creative output happens to be original compositions for the solo piano. I think they were different personalities and yet very, very much the same. As we look at the great composers for the piano in the 19th century, unquestionably at the top of the list would be Chopin and Liszt.
Well, I'm going to throw in another figure who was from the same era, who I adore. I visited his home and I've studied his work a lot, and I've lectured about him a fair amount. Little Edvard Grieg, born in 1843 in Bergen and died 1907. Grieg had terrible lungs, and his doctor required that he not spend long Norwegian winters up north, so that he would travel the continent, but especially Italy and other places, for his health, ostensibly. And he would compose and conduct and go on long tours and do his famous piano concerto in A. And but he spent a lot of time in Leipzig. He knew a lot of the other great composers who were Leipzig composers. He studied Bach, I'm sure. He must have known Mendelssohn. There was, maybe not, there would not have been enough of an overlap, but probably Brahms.
Very much so, yes.
And possibly Schumann, I would think. But also Leipzig is particular because many of the great music publishers are in Leipzig. So it becomes a destination for people who want to get the latest scores. And
I have to say, I have a special, I agree with you, and I have a special affection for the music of Grieg, particularly the lyric pieces for the piano. There's a certain naivete about them. And Grieg always used to say, I hope I never lose that.
Yeah.
The naivete, the certain sense of innocence. And you mentioned Leipzig, and it's very appropriate that you do. One of the programs I'm doing later this season is called The Three Great Romantics, Brahms, Tchaikovsky, and Grieg. They were to meet for the first and only time on New Year's Day in Leipzig.
So, Jeffrey, there was a slight Zoom lag, and I'm going to ask you when you unfreeze to repeat what you said. Jeffrey, I don't know if you heard me.
Here are composers in their time.
Jeffrey, I don't know if you heard me, but I'm going to ask you to repeat what the commonality was of the three men in Leipzig.
The three men in Leipzig, Brahms, Tchaikovsky, and Grieg, they met for this only time on the first day party in the home of the concertmaster of the orchestra in Leipzig. And here are three composers who were recognized as great composers in their life, the great composer that they are, and how they admired each other and admired each other's music. This is part of the program I have in mind for the spring season. But no, I'm a fellow Grieg lover right along with you. I love the music of Grieg.
So let's see, are you doing that in New York City?
Yes.
Yes, you are. April 30th. Damn, I'm teaching at NYU that night. God. I know my NYU dates. And I don't say damn on the air very often, but I'll have to figure this one out. But why do you spell Tchaikovsky as you do? Tschaikovsky.
It's one of the I have often seen.
So, Jeffrey, I got a note from my wonderful engineer, Johan, in Berlin, that it doesn't work out in the long run with your connection. and he recommends that we try having you do this without your camera on. I love to see you, but apparently it interferes with the speech, and I'd love to hear you too.
That's fine. You don't need my photo. That's fine.
Okay. So, Johan, are you able to remove Jeffrey's image without the sound? Or does Jeffrey do that? Okay, Jeffrey
I'm
Siegel.
gone. Yes,
Speak, Jeffrey. Go ahead now.
I'm fine. I
Good.
think we're okay. Yeah.
Okay. So the three men in Leipzig were there on the first of something, is what I heard.
Yeah, the 1st of January, it was a New Year's Day party. I think it was 1888. And they all happened to be in the city that you mentioned, but was so important, Grieg and Tchaikovsky and Brahms. And, you know, very often we're asked if you could go back in history on one day, where would you like to be? I often think that's where I'd like to be with those three.
I would like to be at the unveiling of the Sistine Chapel on October 31st, 1512 in Rome, in the Vatican. Now, Jeffrey, I don't know if you can hear me. I can't quite tell now. So say yes if you can hear me.
I can hear you. Yes.
Oh, very good. Okay. Since I mentioned, I asked you about the spelling of Tchaikovsky. Tschiakiwsky. Why did you choose that spelling?
I don't think that's the spelling I chose. Is there an A in the middle there?
Yes.
That's a
Tschiaikowsky.
That must be a misprint.
Okay. Since I'm mentioning the Sistine Chapel, I didn't plan to, but in my study of Liszt, something I've been lately very fascinated with was his time in Rome, about which I knew just a little, but not as much as I've come to learn. And he was, in his religious phase, fascinated by the Vatican, also repulsed by it because he could not get permission to marry the woman he wanted to marry. But do you know about Liszt in Rome and his relationship to religious music and sacred music and playing in the great halls of the Vatican?
Yes, I know a little bit.
I'd love to hear about it.
This was very sincere on Liszt's part. And I think he was in his late 40s or early 50s when he took minor orders in the Catholic Church. And from that time was addressed as Abbé Liszt, and he wore a monk's cloth and was frequently in devotional prayer, and a very saintly man. Yes.
One of his pieces that I really love, and I'm just studying now, is the Année. My French is not perfect. Année de pèlerinage. In other words, the years of pilgrimage, in which Liszt traveled about as a pilgrim, as a traveler, as a wanderer, and as someone myself who loves travel. This expression of his interest in being a pilgrim and learning and exploring, that he weaves into the music without it being autobiographical, is a very impressive work.
Tremendously so. And of course, this is written at an earlier time in the composer's life. In fact, he's traveling with Marie de Goul, who is left her husband and her child to run off with that piano player, Franz Liszt.
Yeah.
And she is a very intelligent, bright woman, and she opens Liszt's eyes to the beauty of nature that they see in Switzerland and to the great works of art that they see in Italy together. And it would perhaps be not over stressing to say that she was a major influence in him being able to write these pieces of music.
Now, when I don't get enough sleep, I often have imaginings about movies being made about composers, and there have been at least two films made about Liszt, one of them with Dirk Bogarde and the other was by Ken Russell, and I forget who played it. Oh no, it was The Who, sorry. But do you have an image right now of the actress Glenn Close?
Yes.
I think she could play Liszt without having to do much makeup. And I would love to see that. And I think she's such a wonderful actress. I think she'd be very impressive. And I think she'd capture his spirit very well. Does that interest you, or am I crazy?
I think that Liszt life is one that would be very interesting for any filmmaker to take on. Liszt was asked towards the end of his life if he would write his autobiography, and he said, "Madam, it's been enough for me to live such a life."
I like that. Um, I there are certain public figures, one of them being Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, who avowedly chose to remain private, and that her life was lived as it was, and to describe it was not necessary. And in Verdi's Ernani, there's a famous line I love: "Ogni cor serba un mistero." Every heart harbors a mystery. And I love that part of it with Jacqueline Kennedy and perhaps with Liszt and certain other figures is that we don't really know. I think with Beethoven as well, we don't really know, and that's good in a way, because it gives us a portal to more actively investigate and to come to our own conclusions, right or wrong as they may be. And so I respect Liszt for that, but I would still like to see a film about it.
Yeah, I think a film by a serious filmmaker, and he would not have to invent very much. It's all there. It's an
Yeah,
extraordinary life, and as Liz said, it was enough to live such a life. He didn't
yeah.
have to write an autobiography.
Are there other composers or pianists whose lives you think merit a biography in print or a film version that have not been covered?
That's an interesting question. Um, I think Debussy's life would be an interesting one. Um, would be an interesting one. What inspired him in 1936 to leave the West as a free man and to go back to what
Prokofiev,
was
yeah.
now the Soviet Union? Um, it's interesting. And Rachmaninoff's life, where he left Russia in 1918, a wealthy aristocratic landowner who saw his way of life going to change forever, and he made his way to the West, but his love of Russia and everything Russian stayed at the core of his being. I think these all interest stories that would be of interest to a lot of people.
And Prokofiev's great dramatic ending, of course, is that he died on March 5th, 1953, the same day as Joseph Stalin.
Right.
So
Right.
that's like poor George Schulte, who I loved, died the same week as Princess Diana and Mother Teresa.
Yes.
So while for me, I mean, God bless the other two, but George Schulte deserved as much coverage as Princess Diana and certainly Mother Teresa, in my view. But he was forgotten in the mix. I was in Italy when that happened, and Schulte died in Italy, and I was in Liguria, which is the big flower growing part of Italy. And normally there would have been flowers to send for Schulte. They had all been sent to London for Princess Diana. Our fields were completely devoid of flowers. There were just these little stems there, because every flower that could be cut and sold went to London. So there were no flowers for George Schulte.
Yeah. On one hand, I only knew him a little bit. I think part of him would have been amused by this, and part of it would have been angry. But no, he was extraordinary. I share your reverence for him.
Yeah.
And he never forgot how difficult it was. It's why he took the time to audition young people. I once asked him, I thanked him for making time to hear me. It was like to be your age. I remember how difficult it was. And he never forgot this. And also, he never tried to pretend that he had other than Jewish roots.
Yeah. Like Rubinstein.
Yeah.
The same. Rubinstein, to my knowledge, was agnostic, but understood himself to be a cultural Jew, if not a religious Jew.
Right.
And he raised money for progressive Jewish causes. I add progressive. And Happy New Year. Shana Tova, as Arthur Rubinstein and George Schulte would have said.
Yes, absolutely.
Jeffrey, it has been wonderful, really wonderful to have you in conversation. And I remind listeners that Jeffrey conducts keyboard conversations, Jeffrey Siegel, keyboardconversations.com, coming to a city near you if you're in North America. If you are visiting North America, look them up because you're really doing sort of the grand tour. And if you're in the desert or in Arizona or Florida in the winter, it seems, if wherever the weather is best at a certain season, Jeffrey Siegel will be there doing keyboard conversations. So Jeffrey,
Thank
thank
you.
you so much, and I'll see
Thank
you
you
soon.
very much. Thank